Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. The New York Times has a brand new article about Greenland. Yes, Greenland's ice is melting. The amount of misinformation in this article is pretty spectacular, and I'm going to go through it one piece at a time. The article starts out with a picture of ice calving off of a glacier in Greenland. And this is supposed to be evidence that the ice is melting. This is a common theme among climate alarmists who don't understand science. Huge amounts of snow and ice build up in the interior of Greenland, and then the ice flows down to the sea in glaciers, which are rivers of ice. When the glacier gets to the sea, the ice breaks off in what's known as calving events. This forms icebergs like the one which sank the Titanic in 1912. The reason this is happening is because there's excess ice in the interior which is flowing to the sea. What we're watching is a waterfall of ice. Saying that this is evidence of glaciers melting is equivalent to saying that water flowing over Niagara Falls is evidence of a drought. The New York Times author is getting off to a very bad start, and his story just gets worse. He said, "A trip to Greenland changed my mind about climate change while reinforcing my belief that markets, not government, provide the cure." Now he's saying that humans have the ability to stop the natural processes which have occurred in Greenland for tens of thousands of years. We haven't even gotten to the text of the article yet, and the author's already nearly struck out. Now let's look at the article text. On a clear day in August, a helicopter set me and a few companions down on the northern end of the Jakobshavn Glacier in western Greenland, about 150 miles north of the Arctic Circle. I asked the pilot to give me a sense of how much the glacier had retreated since he'd been flying the route. He pointed to a distant rocky island in the middle of the fjord. That's where the glacier was in 2007. Over the course of the 20th century, the Jakobshavn Glacier retreated about 10 to 15 kilometers. Over just the next 8 years, it retreated about the same amount, according to the oceanographer Josh Willis of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Later, the front advanced a little, a function of complex dynamics partly involving ocean currents, before resuming its retreat. For anyone who has entertained doubts about the warming of the planet, a trip to Greenland serves as a bracing corrective. Flying low over the vast ice sheet that covers most of the island, I immediately noticed large ponds of meltwater and dozens of fast-flowing streams, rushing through gullies of white ice and sometimes disappearing into vertical ice caverns thousands of feet deep. Such lakes, scientists report, have become far more common over the last 2 decades, occurring earlier in the year at higher elevations. Last year, it even rained at the highest point of the ice sheet, some 500 miles north of the Arctic Circle. That's a first since record-keeping began in the 1980s. We've heard what Brett Stevens has to say, now let's look at the actual facts. He said that record-keeping about rain began in the 1980s. But they had rain near the center of the Greenland ice sheet both in 1950 and in 1933. The author has already struck out with 3 gross pieces of misinformation, but I'm going to continue. This graph shows the surface mass balance of Greenland. It shows the difference between snow accumulation and melt from September 1st through the end of August the following year. On average, about 370 billion tons more snow falls on Greenland than melts off the surface every year. The snow accumulates from September 1st through the middle of June the following year, and then melts for a few weeks during their very short summer. The New York Times author flew over the Greenland ice sheet during their very short summer, and not surprisingly, he saw snow and ice melting. In order to maintain equilibrium, all 600 billion tons of snow which falls on Greenland every year has to return to the sea. This occurs either through surface melting or through glaciers calving into the ocean. If this release mechanism didn't occur, the ice in Greenland would pile up to the top of the troposphere. That obviously can't happen, but it would appear that the New York Times author doesn't understand that. Surface melting and glaciers calving are an essential part of the system which maintains equilibrium in Greenland. Over the past 2 months, 150 billion tons of snow has already accumulated on Greenland's surface, which is well above the average. That averages out to about 2.5 billion tons of new snow every single day for the past 2 months. The 2022-2023 season appears headed to be the 5th year out of the last 7 when the surface mass balance was above average. Greenland is not melting down. Now let's look at his claims about the Jacobshavn Glacier. According to Josh Willis, the NASA person quoted in the New York Times article, the Jacobshavn Glacier grew 3 years in a row from 2016 through 2019. Here's an article about it from Nature Geoscience in 2019. They said ocean temperatures in the bay's upper 250 meters have cooled to levels not seen since the mid-1980s. The Jacobshavn Glacier retreated more from 1850 to 1950 than it has since. From 1964 to 2001 there was almost no retreat, but over the next 10 years it retreated quite a bit. And from 2016 through 2019, the glacier was actually growing. This doesn't look much like global warming. The author of the New York Times article conveniently forgot to mention that the glacier retreated very rapidly from 1851 through the end of the 19th century. According to the official documents of the climate religion, Michael Mann's hockey stick, temperatures were very cold around 1850. So why was the glacier rapidly retreating during that time? Here's an article from 1939. All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting, declared Professor Hans Ullmann, Swedish geologist, in a report to the Geographical Society. It may without exaggeration be said that the glaciers of Greenland, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. But according to the hockey stick, temperatures around that time were actually quite cool. 100 years ago in 1922, it was reported that except over a small area, it is generally understood the glaciers of the world are retreating to the mountains. In 1911, there was grave news about glaciers. They are disappearing. Alaska's largest glacier at Glacier Bay retreated tens of miles from 1780 to 1860. In 1902, it was reported that the famous glaciers of the Rhone have shrunk several thousand feet in the last 20 years. In 1922, a radical change in climatic conditions was reported in the Arctic. The Arctic Ocean is warming up, icebergs are growing scarcer, and in some places the seals are finding the waters too hot, according to a report from the Commerce Department today. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers all point to a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in the Arctic zone. Great masses of ice have been replaced by moraines of earth and stones, the report continued, while at many points well-known glaciers have disappeared entirely. But according to the hockey stick, temperatures around that time were closest to the coldest on record. In 1923, Glacier National Park was melting so quickly, experts predicted the glaciers would be gone by 1950. Glaciers in Austria retreated very rapidly from 1903 to 1929, then into 1940, and then by 1956 they were gone. And the same thing was occurring in Norway. This is 1869 and this is 1946. In 1958, the New York Times reported that the glaciers of the western United States had lost 50% of their ice in the past 70 years. That was back in the days when the New York Times still occasionally told the truth. If we go back further in time, about 5,000 years, the Arctic was ice-free and trees grew all the way to the edge of the Arctic Circle. Temperatures along the northern coastline of Russia may have been 2.5 to 7 degrees Celsius warmer than now. The New York Times author noted that the Jacobshavn Glacier had retreated, but he forgot to mention that there was more retreat from 1850 to 1950 than there has been since. And he noted melting on the surface, which he said convinced him that global warming was real. But about 200 billion tons of ice and snow melts every summer on Greenland. He said that it rained in the center of the Greenland ice sheet for the first time since record-keeping began in the 1980s, but this actually occurred in 1950 and 1933. The author reached all kinds of conclusions which had nothing to do with reality, which is pretty typical for the New York Times. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on these scamsters for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie Caesar, Toki, and Upla on the web at realclimatescience.com.